was lost either because liberal leaders like Franklin Roosevelt were too feckless and really capitalists in sheep's clothing, or because they just didn't understand the historical circumstance they were in and muffed the chance. Now, as I say, this view had a very short shelf life. It was popular for a decade or so in the late 60s and early 70s. It didn't really have a lot of staying power, but it stimulated another round of scholarship, actually, revisiting the New Deal and asking questions like, were there real alternatives to the left of what Franklin Roosevelt actually did? And in those accounts, actually, people like Huey Long and the person he's sometimes paired with, Father Coughlin, figure rather prominently. This view, in a sense, here's one summary description of the essence of this view. It goes back to a famous exchange between the president of the, or whatever his title was, head chairman of the American Socialist Party, Norman Thomas, in a conversation with a journalist in the late 1930s. And the journalist asked Norman Thomas, the head of the American Socialist Party, he said, "Isn't it true, Mr. Thomas, that the New Deal has carried out the programs of the American Socialist Party?" And Norman Thomas said, "Yes, that's true. It's carried them out on a stretcher." And this was sort of the essence of this so-called New Left or revisionist view. The New Deal did just enough to blunt the force of the request for more radical policies. Again, to make a long story short, two historians in particular, I think, took this idea on. Alan Brinkley at Columbia and Elizabeth Cohen, who's my textbook co-author now at Harvard, and in two landmark books, I think. Brinkley's Voices of Protest, which is about Huey Long and Father Coughlin, and Liz Cohen's book, Making a New Deal. Two of them really tried to, as best they could, to get a grip on this idea. Was there some more political space to the left that Franklin Roosevelt just didn't go into for whatever reason? And again, to make a long and complicated story short, their conclusion was no, that the New Deal really tested the leftmost limits of American political culture. There really was not much realistic prospect of anything more radical happening. Okay? And that's essentially my view, that the New Deal represented a moment in American history when there was significant opportunity for reform, but there were limits to that opportunity. And it's a pipe dream to think that it really could have done an awful lot more. And that cuts across a lot of areas, including economic policy, race policy, social welfare policy, and so on. Okay. All right, so that's all by way of kind of framing this question. But what I want to do now, and this is going to get a little bit heavy, I'll warn you ahead of time. I want to go through certain sectors of our society in the 1930s and look in some bit of detail as to just exactly what the New Deal did, what it actually accomplished. And as we go through these examples, I'm going to go through the financial sector, the banking sector, the housing sector, and old age insurance, Social Security, in some bit of detail. I'll put you on notice. This is going to get a little heavy going. But the question we're trying to answer here along the way is, which of these three general interpretive schemes, liberal, conservative, or revisionist, best captures the actual detail of what the New Deal accomplished in the 1930s, okay? Again, I'll just say by way of anticipating where we're going, my view is that none of these interpretive categories really get the story right, and we've got to think about this in a fresh way. Okay. All right, so let's talk first about the financial sector. That is what today we would call investment banking, stock and bond trading, okay? The thing that one needs to understand or remember or know about this sector, the stock markets, let's just call it that for short, is that prior to the 1930s, the stock markets had qualities of being like casinos that make today's casino-like behavior in the stock markets look very, very tame. There were no published annual reports of firms whose stocks were traded on the New York Stock Exchange or other stock exchanges. And the important point to note here is how absolutely devoid of reliable information was out there about the firms whose stocks were publicly traded on the exchanges. The Congress of the United States and other entities, in fact, in New York State in particular, where the stock exchange is located, a big one, periodically worried about this and thought about reforming it. And one of the times when they visited this matter was in 1899. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from some congressional testimony in 1899, which just serves, I think, as a kind of colorful reminder of just how information poor stock trading was before the 1930s. This is an excerpt from the testimony of a guy by the name of Henry Havemeyer. He was the head of the American Sugar Refining Company, which at that time controlled about 95% of all U.S. sugar refining. And he was testifying before Congress about the prospect of a bill that would impose some level of regulation on stock trading. And the congressman interviewing him asked the following question. You think then, Mr. Havemeyer, that when a corporation is chartered by the state and offers stock to the public, that the public has no right to know what its earning power is or to subject them to any inspection whatsoever? And Havemeyer replied as follows, and this is the authentic and absolutely unfiltered, unqualified voice of 19th century laissez-faire. He said, yes, that is my theory. Let the buyer beware, that covers the whole business. You cannot wet nurse people from the time they are born until the time they die. They've got to wade in and get stuck, and that is the way men are educated and cultivated. Well, there it is. Why do you think J.P. Morgan and all those titans of finance in the late 19th, early 20th century put their men, as it were, their agents, on the boards of directors of these companies? It wasn't necessarily to control the operations of the companies. It was to get some reliable information about what was going on in these companies like U.S. Steel and so on, in which they'd invested so much of their money because there was no other way to get it, okay? So what happens in the 1930s? Again, it's in the wake of this great stock market crash and huge disruption of the banking system. What happens? Well, the Congress creates something in 1934 that's still with us today. You're all familiar with it, at least by name, called the Securities Exchange Commission. Now, what does the Securities Exchange Commission do, the SEC? What's its job? Okay? Its job is to compel any firm that wants to trade its stock on the public exchanges, like the New York Stock Exchange, to issue periodic reports on the state of its business. A balance sheet that shows its debt to equity ratios, a profit and loss statement that shows its operating results for the previous quarter or year, executive compensation, both in terms of cash and stock options, all has to be recorded. And anybody who wants to trade their stock with the New York Stock Exchange has access to that information, and on the basis of that information, if they choose to read it or take it on board, can make a decision whether to buy or sell. What's more, the SEC, when it came into being in 1934, not only required the periodic publication of these kinds of data, but required that they be audited by independent auditing agencies. No firm could just spew out its own data and ask people to take it on faith. There had to be independent audits of the accuracy of this information. That's what the SEC does. A major, major reform in the way stocks are traded, bonds are traded, and the equity and stock markets work. Now, was this an anti-capitalist or anti-business reform? Yes, it imposed a little bit of an extra burden of cost on firms that wanted to be traded publicly. They had to generate the data. They had to be sure the data was accurate by having it checked by an outside auditing firm and so on. But in the larger picture of the theory of how markets work, this is what economists would call a market-enhancing reform. Because economic theory tells us that transactions, buy and sell transactions, will be most efficient. That is, the resource in question will be best utilized by all interested parties if everybody understands the value of this asset on the same basis, and every party to the transaction, both parties, buyer and seller, are taking their position, either a buyer or sell position, on the basis of the same and accurate information. This makes markets more efficient. So the SEC, in a sense, was a market-enhancing reform that made capital markets more efficient. And indeed, if you ask, how did it happen that we went from about 2.5% of Americans who owned stock in 1929 to over 50% by the opening of the 21st century, among the major explanations of why you have that revolution in stock ownership is because the SEC guarantees that there is accurate information that people can have access to when they buy and sell these things. So I'm going to make this word up, but the SEC in effect largely de-casinoized the stock market transaction, made stock markets more efficient, and thereby, according to all we know about economic theory, this institution that's at the heart of capitalism, that allocates capital, investment money to make things work, became a more efficient mechanism. Now, is that anti-business? Is that somehow selling out to capitalism or getting in bed with capitalism? It doesn't really answer to either of those definitions, it seems to me. It's a reform that is consistent with the historic structure of the major institutions in the economy, capitalism, investment banking, finance, and so on and so forth, but doesn't really distort their operation, rather enhances and makes more efficient their operation. So how do we capture that fact in these three interpretive schemes of liberal, conservative, and revisionist that I was discussing earlier? I think it's very difficult to do. Okay, let's take a closely related sector, and that's banking. As I say, bank failures were just enormous in the 1929-1933 period. About 5,000 plus banks fail. What's less well known is that in the supposedly prosperous heyday of the 1920s, banks failed in the 1920s at the rate of about between 300 and 800 per year, even in times of supposed prosperity and economic growth. In other words, this society had an enormously volatile and vulnerable banking system. Again, I give you the contrasting example of Canada. 5 banks, none failed, 25,000 banks in the US and 5,000 plus failed. Again, this is a great legacy of the Jacksonian era. I'm sure everybody in this room has seen it probably more than once. The film that shows every Christmas time, It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart running the Bailey Savings and Loan. And you remember the famous scene where all of his depositors come in and they want their money out because there's a banking panic, and he persuades people to only take $2 instead of 10 or whatever, and he gets through the day and he's got like $3 worth at the end of the day of his money, and the bank is saved, at least for that day. The savings loan is saved. That scene was common throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, and of course it became extremely common during the Great Depression's onset, 1929 to 1933. We've seen, even right down to the present day in the Great Recession of the last 3-4 years, we've seen nothing comparable to that. Our banking system, again until very, very recently, has been just remarkably stable to a degree it was not from the 19th century well down to through the first third of the 20th century. What's changed? Well, what's changed again is dates to the New Deal. And not least of all, the creation in 1933 of something called the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And if you have bank savings accounts, you know, or certificates of deposit of banks or whatever, you know that your savings are insured by a federally backed entity called the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So if there's volatility and challenge to the stability of the banking system, you don't think I have to run down to the bank and get my money out because I know I'm insured up to a certain level. I don't have to panic. So these panic-driven runs on banks that were just a common feature of American life and became, as I say, exceptionally prominent in the early years of the Depression, it all goes away because of this very simple device of the FDIC. How does the FDIC work?